Today's reading is from the book of 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, verses 6 through 10. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. There is great gain in godliness with contentment, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and hurtful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced their hearts with many pangs. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
How many of you have seen 1987's Robocop? It's quite a few of you. Now, how many of you have seen one of the sequels to Robocop? Fewer of you. How many of you saw the cartoon or played with the children's toys? Some. I think there is even a short-lived live-action series and a 2014 reboot. Diego and I were talking, and we both experienced Robocop for the first time as the cartoon series. But I think it's safe to say that none of the subsequent media quite captured the magic of the original Robocop, and in fact, kind of became the very thing that Robocop was critiquing. And Robocop was critiquing the American system. More about that in just a moment. Robocop, as it stands, could be interpreted as a pretty straightforward story. There is this police officer named Alex Murphy who is transferred to a police precinct in Old Detroit, which is in 2029, and Detroit as if it had continued like it was in the 1980s. But there is a corporation called OCP that wants to develop Old Detroit into a new city in which they can make a lot more money called Delta City. But in order to do that, they need to get rid of the crime in Old Detroit. And so Alex Murphy is on his first day on the job, and he's with his new partner, and they encounter a terrible gang, and they decide to go off on their own while they're waiting for backup and try to take down the gang in an old factory by themselves. And it does not end well for Alex Murphy. He is gunned down in a brutal, violent fashion and is soon declared dead. But the police force is in the process of being privatized by OCP, and so OCP gets the rights to Alex Murphy's dead body, and they decide to turn him into a robot cop, Robocop. They had a prototype that didn't have a human being in it, but that accidentally killed one of the executives in a very vicious manner, and so they decided it might be good if there was a human element. And so Alex Murphy is transformed into Robocop, and his memory is wiped. Robocop then proceeds to go clean up Old Detroit, but before long, Murphy's memories start to come back. He starts to remember who he had once been, and then he remembers the gang that had killed him, and he goes and takes them out one by one in a fashion that can only be seen in an 80s movie. And then he gradually discovers that that gang actually was in the employ of one of the OCP executives, and eventually takes out that executive as he reclaims his humanity, not as Robocop, but as Murphy. It's something that could be interpreted just like that on the surface, a fun jaunt. But it's actually a much deeper story. He said Ed Niemeyer wrote Robocop after being on the set of Blade Runner, and he was just kind of helping out, and he saw one of the vehicles in Blade Runner, and he thought, wouldn't it be cool if there was a robot next to that? And he said, not like a robot in Blade Runner, a replicant that looks like a human being, but one that looks like an actual robot. That's what we need. And he began to dream this up. And he also, through this process, brought on a director through Orion Pictures named Paul Verhoeven, who was a Dutch director known for being pretty violent. And together, they collaborated on creating this unique 80s blend of something that wasn't just a sci-fi action thriller, but a sci-fi action thriller satirical comedy, which is very unique. And so in Robocop, we find a critique of three elements of society and a theological critique as well. So first we see a critique of corporate America. As I said, in the movie, OCP is planning to develop old Detroit into Delta City and to privatize the police force. We see throughout the movie that there is little to no concern about actual human life. It's product, not people. We also see several commercials that are interspersed throughout the movie that forecast a 24-hour news cycle and show a fictional television series created for Robocop called It's Not My Problem. And there's a Benny Hill type character who looks at the camera, often after being surrounded by young, scantily clad women, saying, "I'll buy that for $1." A phrase that doesn't mean much other than the commoditization of absolutely everything, even people. The second thing that it critiques is America's obsession with violence. Paul Verhoeven was Dutch, and he was especially concerned with showing how hyper-obsessed America is with violence. And so, if you watch Robocop, it is, especially for the 1980s, hyper-violent. Verhoeven's phrase throughout the filming of this movie was, more, I want it bigger, more blood, bigger explosions, to show his perspective of what America's obsession with violence was like. The third thing that it critiques about American culture is the increased militarization of the police force. Of course, in Robocop himself was developed as a prototype that OCP hoped to test out on civilians and then sell to the military to make money. And then the fourth theme in Robocop is a theological theme, and it's one that Paul Verhoeven brought. You see, Paul Verhoeven was obsessed with the quest for the historical Jesus. And this to me was fascinating because the original version of Robocop had nothing theological in it. But Paul Verhoeven wanted a theological statement. And when I say the quest for the historical Jesus, what I mean is there is a section of scholarship that is especially concerned with finding out who the actual person of Jesus was. That means stripping away the dogma that comes from religion and says, who can all religions, all people agree that the historical person was? And in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a group that was particularly active called the Jesus Seminar. It still exists, but it was especially active in the late 80s and early 90s. And Paul Verhoeven was a member of this group. In fact, he was the only member not to have a degree in religion. And the Jesus Seminar looked at every saying of Jesus to try and determine which ones they thought actually originated with the historical person. They used a number of criteria to determine this, but I think the most important is one called multiple independent attestation. You ever heard of that? Multiple independent attestation. What that means is that if you look at a saying of Jesus and you can find it in different sources that did not depend on each other, it's more likely that he said it. And that makes sense, right? If you find things in multiple sources, it's more likely to be factual, more likely to be true. And so if you look at a saying of Jesus and you say, find it in the Gospel of Mark, which is the oldest gospel that we have in the New Testament, and you find it in the Gospel of Thomas, which did not depend on the Gospel of Mark, it's more likely that Jesus said that. It's in two different places. So the Jesus Seminar then went through and voted on the sayings of Jesus based on this and other criteria and put them into 4 different categories. The first category was red. Yes, Jesus said this or something very close. Pink, this sounds a lot like Jesus. He probably said something like this. Gray, that doesn't sound so much like Jesus anymore. Or black, Jesus probably didn't say that. So Paul Verhoeven was involved in this process and was particularly interested in bringing a resurrection theme to Robocop. And you see, in Robocop, Alex Murphy is killed by a corporation and then rediscovers his humanity, experiences a resurrection, which is symbolic of the work of the Jesus Seminar in the quest for the historical Jesus. Did you know that about Robocop? Had you all heard about any of this? It's pretty deep. You can probably see why this is one of my favorite movies. I know that we're talking about pop culture theology, and you probably thought, why have we dug back into the 1980s for this stuff? Robocop was at the top of my list of shows that I wanted to talk about because it is so theologically rich. And as I rewatched it, there was one verse that kept resounding in my head, and it was from 1 Timothy 6. Now, 1 Timothy, you all read 1 Timothy very often? 1 Timothy, it's an epistle, but it is an epistle that belongs to a certain category. So there are 3 different categories of epistles. There are the Pauline epistles. Those are the ones that we know he wrote, right? Like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, those. Then there are some that are disputed Pauline epistles, like say Ephesians, that scholars are like, we're not so sure that Paul wrote that one. And then there are Deutero-Pauline epistles. Those are letters that may have Paul's name on them, but scholars universally pretty much agree that he didn't write because they don't sound like Paul. And 1st and 2nd Timothy belong to that latter category, and that's just important to know as you're reading, because a lot of people read through the Bible and they're like, man, Paul was awful. And yeah, sometimes he was, and sometimes he was great, but a lot of the awful theology doesn't actually come from Paul. It comes from later people who signed Paul's name on their letter. But in this case, I think that the author of Timothy, Paul, and Jesus would agree. In today's scripture lesson, we hear a very famous line that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's often paraphrased as money is the root of all evil. But what it says is the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And I think another way to say that is that when you care more about money than people, it never ends well, especially for those with little money and little power. And if you look to the entire biblical text, we find warnings about this over and over again, that when people accumulate too much money and power, it's not good for them, and it's not good for anyone else either. In Robocop, we find this unique 80s blend of warning about love of money and power, But it's a message that can pretty easily be transferred to 2025, can't it? I mean, if we look at those themes that we find in Robocop about the evil of corporations, I mean, in the United States today, we're no longer even getting the message that we're giving corporations tax breaks so that that can eventually trickle down to everyone else, something that never happened, right? We don't even get that anymore. Instead, we just find corporate tax breaks so that people at the top can accumulate more while nothing ever goes down to anyone else. And we make the rich richer. Corporations are treated like people, while people who are marginalized are treated as less than human. Corporations, as we know, are also the largest contributor of greenhouse gases, meaning that corporations are primarily responsible for climate change. All the talk about us reforming our practices is well and good, but for us to actually combat climate change, we have to pass regulations on corporations and require them to green their practices, or else it doesn't make any difference. I mean, we can see corporate greed in the United States still, can't we? And we can also see the other theological elements here as well, like obsession with violence in the United States. We need look no further than the actions taken yesterday to see this, where the president unilaterally decided to bomb Iran, arguably as a distraction for what is going on in our country, to kill people in another country. You know, anytime we go and try to start something in the Middle East, it never goes well. I'm reminded of the invasion of Iraq, which, even though it enjoyed popular support at the time, within a decade, everybody, even the people who had supported that, said, yeah, this was a really bad idea. We shouldn't have done that. America is obsessed with using violence to solve problems, aren't we? Robocop also talks about the increased militarization of police forces. And God, can't we just look around the country and see that? We have seen the militarization of a government entity of ICE, so much so that now people can put a mask on their face, can carry a gun and not even present a badge, and we don't even know if they are government agents or not. And we have certainly seen this in Los Angeles. Did you see this week that ICE showed up at Dodger Stadium and was turned away? Did you see that last week ICE, or someone saying they were ICE, showed up at a Christian Church Disciples of Christ congregation and pointed their gun at the pastor and said, "Let us in"? And the pastor, even though she had a gun pointed at her, said, "No, not here. This is God's house and you cannot come in." Did you see that? Or Marcella sent me a video of the town where I used to live, Springfield, Missouri. Last week they were gathering for a pride parade, a pride festival, and men showed up in an unmarked moving van, and they came out with guns and their faces covered, and they pointed it at the protesters, and the protesters, who were actually not protesters at all, they were just there celebrating pride, said, "Not here, not today, get back in your truck," and they did. The increased militarization of the police force is something we can clearly see today, isn't it? And Paul Verhoeven's contribution to this movie, his knowledge about reclaiming humanity, is something that speaks really loudly today, too, isn't it? Because, I would say that our moral compass, that our democracy right now looks a whole lot like Alex Murphy in that opening scene of Robocop, where he is blown to bits little by little and almost nothing is left. And yet throughout the movie, he is put back together and slowly reclaims his humanity. Isn't that what we need in our society today? A reclaiming of our common humanity? Isn't what we need a reclaiming of our moral compass? Isn't what we need a reclaiming of something we used to call the common good? And you don't even have to be religious to believe in that. All you have to do is believe that everybody is worth having around. All you have to do is believe that you ought to care about other people. In religion, we call that the inherent worth and dignity of each and every person, claiming your identity as a child of God. And that is a deeply theological thing for us as Christians, because it's not just something we ought to do, it's something we have to do if we're going to follow Jesus. Because we can't truly follow Jesus unless we are declaring that absolutely every person matters. Now see, that's a pretty theologically rich movie, I think. An oft misunderstood movie between Niemeyer and Paul Verhoeven. They also collaborated on another oft misunderstood movie in the 90s called Starship Troopers. And a lot of people thought, ooh, this is bad, including critics. This condones fascism. And then they watched it again and paid attention. They're like, oh wait, no, this is a critique of fascism. Actually, this is a really incredible movie. Today, our call is to critique fascism. Today, our call is to reclaim our common humanity. Today, our call is to work for a better society and a society more like the Basileia, the reign of God. May it be so. And thanks be to God. Amen.